Hello and welcome to our weekly daily Bible reading video. I hope you've been keeping up with your readings in the Gospel of John this week, and I hope you're having a great final week of Advent as we prepare ourselves for Christmas coming next Monday. I just want to remind you that on Sunday we will have our normal schedule, worship services at 8:45 and 11, and then Sunday school in between, and then on Sunday evening, Christmas Eve evening, at 5 o'clock, we will meet here in the sanctuary for our candlelight communion service. It'll be a great time of worship and togetherness, and so I hope you'll plan on being there with your family. As we look at John chapter 6 today, we are pressed to make a decision about who Jesus is by the end of the chapter. And this chapter is framed around encounters that Jesus has with two groups of people. And really in this chapter, you're going to be asked, which of those two groups of people do I belong with? The first group is the disciples, those who are following Jesus, those who are a part of his ministry. They are sharing in the work that he's doing in the world while also learning from him. And the other group is the crowd. The crowd, they hang around Jesus. They might be interested in what he's saying and doing, but they haven't necessarily made a decision about Jesus and who he is, and definitely not who he is to them. And by the end, we're going to be asked, are you a disciple? Or are you part of the crowd? Are you going to stick with Jesus? Or are you going to walk off and do your own thing, be distracted by something else? And I think really this is a very appropriate question for us to ask as we come to the end of Advent and come to Christmas, because a lot of people in our society have been getting ready for Christmas up until this point. And once we celebrate Christmas Day, there's going to be many who decide they're part of the crowd, and they're going to walk away and maybe not give Jesus a second thought once Christmas Day is over and the new year begins. And so the question for all of us is, what effect will Christmas have on us? Will Christmas lead us on to the cross and to the empty tomb? Are we going to allow Christmas to have an impact on us that is daily and weekly and throughout the year? Or are we just going to go about our own thing once the season is gone? John chapter 6 starts with two miracles that Jesus performs that show his lordship and his authority over common elements in the world, similar to what we saw in John chapter 2 when he turned the water into wine at the wedding in Cana of Galilee. This time he demonstrates his authority over the very common elements of food, over bread and fish, and then over the waters of the Sea of Galilee as he walks upon the waters, even in the middle of a storm and winds, in order to reach the disciples in their boat. And whereas the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, look at these instances, these miracles, for the sake of their miraculous nature, John is using them to introduce some theological insights about Jesus, just as he has done up until now throughout his gospel and continues to do, as we will see as we finish his gospel over the next month or so. What John is trying to ask us here is, will we allow Jesus to become the bread that feeds us? And we'll get to that here in just a moment. And will we allow him to be Lord over us and calm us and take us where we want to go, or where he wants us to go, just as he takes the disciples where he wants them to go during the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus gives the disciples an opportunity to assess things as he's about to do this miracle with feeding the 5,000. He asks two of them specifically, what should they do about this hungry crowd that is gathered around them as they are teaching and serving the people and healing their diseases? And the disciples, the two that we see here in this passage, have two different answers and two different responses. First of all, Philip is a little confused about what they're going to do. Where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat? Jesus asks him. And Philip is just astounded and says, there's no way we could even feed them if we had 200 days' wages. I mean, think about what half of a year's wage is for you. And if you were suddenly to have a big dinner party that costs that much money, you would be freaking out a little bit too, just as Philip is. You would be a little bit astonished. But Jesus is wanting to press Philip's faith and wanting Philip to look beyond his own resources to look at Jesus's resources and Jesus's abilities to do what Philip cannot do. Jesus, in all of his ministry, is really pushing the boundaries of what is possible in our frame of reference. Now, the second response that Jesus has comes from Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. And Andrew has a little bit more of a faith response. He notices that there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. He expresses some doubt. He says, what is that among so many people? But he at least is recognizing that they have a little bit to offer. And if we have a little bit to offer and we put that into Jesus's hands, that little bit can become a whole lot. In fact, it can become sufficient. It can become exactly what we need. And we see that then in the miracle story. We see that all of the people are fed, and then there are fragments of the food that is left that is brought back to Jesus. We read this. It says, the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten filled 12 baskets. Not only will Jesus give us enough, but Jesus will provide us with more than we can even use. Jesus is more than enough for us. There's sort of a blink and you'll miss it reference in this chapter that goes back to those 12 baskets full of leftovers. It comes a little bit later when Jesus says that this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me. There is this sense here that Jesus is out to collect the leftovers. He's out to collect the remnants, those people that have been overlooked. And his desire is to bring in the people and not lose any of the people that God has given him, because that's the will of his Father also. And we should have a similar perspective to think about who are the people that are considered the leftovers or the overlooked in our society. And as the church, we are called to be their advocates and the people who work to gather them up into the family of God. The episode that follows the feeding of the 5,000 is when Jesus appears to the disciples as they're on the Sea of Galilee and the winds have picked up and there's a storm brewing, and Jesus appears to them walking on the water. Now, this is a little different than the way that we see it in the other Gospels. There is no account here of Peter getting out of the boat and walking toward Jesus. Instead, Jesus makes a statement of, do not be afraid, it is I. But that it is I that we have in our English is actually the Greek I am. And this is one of those statements that Jesus makes throughout the Gospel of John, where he says, I am. And he identifies himself with the God of the Old Testament, with Yahweh, with the one who was the great I am. He is saying, I am the God of all the creation. Just like he was the one who was able to multiply the bread and the fish, he has control over the winds, the waves, the storms, all of the natural elements of the world. And he's telling them, do not be afraid, whatever you face. They're about to face a lot of persecution. They're about to face that decision point of if they're going to continue with Jesus. There is a lot actually to be afraid of. But Jesus is basically saying, as you find yourself afraid, remember that I am the I am, and I will care for you, and I will get you where you're going. Notice that at the very end of this passage, it says that they wanted to take Jesus into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. If we allow Jesus to be the I am in our stressful situations, he will get us to where we need to be, and he will direct and guide us. Of course, this chapter has a much larger I am statement and a much larger passage where Jesus and then John interpreting Jesus explains that I am statement. And that's the statement that he makes to the crowd. Remember, we're kind of juxtaposing here the disciples and the crowd and how they're going to react. And he tells the crowd, I am the bread of life. And he starts to foreshadow our communion feast and some words that I'm sure sounded very unfamiliar and strange to the crowd about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. But what Jesus is symbolizing here, what he's discussing here, is the fact that he is, again, enough for us. He is the one who sustains us. He is the one who will provide for us. And if we will trust him, then we'll find that we will feast on life. He later, towards the end of the chapter, talks about his words are life. He is showing that his words, his actions, his very person, his very being is what feeds us and nourishes us. The crowd has a little bit of a problem with this. They argue with Jesus. They don't quite grasp the concept of what Jesus is talking about, that they need to depend on him, that he's the bread of life in that way. But Jesus draws some comparison to what God did for the Israelites in the wilderness, that just as God provided the manna for them, which kept them going, kept them moving towards the promised land, that he will keep us moving towards the fulfillment of God's promises in our lives if we will feast on him and on his word. So how do we feast on him? We do things like we're doing right now. We listen to his word. We read his word. We allow it to take root in our hearts and produce spiritual fruit that we can feast on. We also take part in the sacrament that he's foreshadowing here. We participate in communion. We're going to do that on Wednesday night, December 20th, if you come to the longest night service at 6:30. We're going to do that on Christmas Eve evening at 5 o'clock. We do that on a regular rhythm throughout our worship services. So that's one way to do it. Also participating in practices like prayer and worship. All of those things allow us to feast on the bread of life, who is Jesus Christ. So finally, we get at the end of chapter 6 to this decision point. And we read one of the most heartbreaking verses in the whole Bible. Maybe appropriately, it comes in John chapter 6, verse 66. And it says this. It says, because of this, because of the difficult teachings that Jesus was giving about being the bread of life and eating his flesh and drinking his blood, because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. They transitioned from being a disciple to part of the crowd. And Jesus at this point turns to his core group of disciples. And he says, I think with a little bit of a somber tone, he says this, do you also wish to go away? And Peter, blessed Peter, who makes a million mistakes in the Gospels, has one of his shining moments here at the end of John chapter 6. He says, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. Basically, you are our home. Where else could we go and find a home? And we get here John's version of Peter's great confession that we see in the other Gospels. And Peter says, we have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. Basically, that's what a disciple does. When things are rough, when people are turning away, when things are not easy and it becomes difficult to faithfully follow Jesus or understand Jesus, the disciple looks at the situation and says, even here in confusion or difficulty, I'm at home with Jesus Christ. And there's nothing else that I could ever imagine doing or being than doing and being with Jesus in the work of Jesus. To be a true disciple says, I recognize Jesus as the Holy One of God, and he's going to get me through whatever situation I face. So I hope that as we move out of Advent into Christmas and then into the new year and the new seasons of the church, that you will make a statement much like Peter, that you will say to Jesus, you are my home. And even after all of the lights and the glitter and the tinsel fade away, I am still going to be with you no matter what happens. That is the heart of a true disciple. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you soon. And have a wonderful Christmas coming up on Monday.